Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy here for Chess.com, and today I'm going to be showing you guys the ins and outs of the Catalan opening. So the Catalan is reached through the Queen's Gambit decline, which I've actually already covered here on our YouTube channel. So knight f3, knight f6, and now this move, g3. It's important that white first develops their knight to f3 and leaves the queen knight here on b1. And the reason is that this knight doesn't always go to c3. Sometimes in the Catalan we're going to develop this knight to d2 or even to a3. And I'll explain why a little later on. But it's important to make sure that we can keep our development as flexible as possible. But the main point of the Catalan is that we're putting our king bishop on this long diagonal here, instead of its normal spot in the Queen's Gambit decline, which is e2 or d3. And the reason we want to put our bishop on g2 is that this bishop is going to be really good at exerting pressure in the center and all the way to black's queenside. So this is sort of another way of playing the Queen's Gambit, is playing the Catalan opening rather than the traditional sort of classical way of playing it with moves like knight c3, bishop g5, and then e3 and bishop d3. So against the Catalan, black typically has two main ways of responding to it. And black's biggest decision here is whether they want to capture this pawn on c4 or leave their pawn solid on d5 in the center. So capturing the pawn on c4 would lead to what is known as the Open Catalan, and leaving the pawn on d5 would be the Closed Catalan. So let's take a look and see what happens if black chooses not to take this pawn on c4 and just continues his development. So bishop g2, castles, and castles. So black's main problem in pretty much all Queen's Gambit declined openings is the light squared bishop. They need to find a way to develop this bishop and, finish their queenside development. A good way to do that in the Closed Catalan is to complete the development through moves like c6 and b6 and putting this bishop either on b7 or even a6. And then the queen's knight is going to come to d7 and the rook to c8. And eventually black is going to try to play this move, c5. So meanwhile, while black is doing all this stuff, white's plan is typically to try to play this move e4 and open up the long diagonal and open up the center where white has more control and a slight space advantage. So let's say black plays knight d7, and now a good move would be something like queen c2. And the queen is usually very nicely placed on c2 because now we're protecting our pawn on c4 and we're supporting a future e4. And now let's say c6, knight bd2, and b6. And now it's time for white to play e4. And a lot of games go like this, and we reach a position that's very much playable for both sides. Probably white is slightly better because black's position is a little bit passive, but many good players play this way for black, and it's considered a very solid opening against the Catalan. And now if black takes this pawn on e4, after we do trades and black plays bishop b7 to protect the c6 pawn, generally white is always going to be better in these kinds of positions because this bishop on b7 is almost always going to remain passive. So like a move like rook d1 is pretty good, and eventually black needs to play this move c5 to challenge white's center and open up this bishop, and white needs to be able to respond to that move with d5, and this will give white more space and a possible initiative in the center. Black's other option here to this move e4 is just to ignore this pawn and then develop the bishop to either b7 or a6. I think a6 is definitely the more active spot for the bishop, so let's just assume black plays the bishop to a6, and then white should grab more space with e5 and play this move rook e1. And the point of this move is that white's going to use this f1 square to maneuver their pieces to better squares. Like the knight could come to f1 and then to e3, where it exerts more force on the center. And also the bishop can sometimes go to f1 and to d3, where it can attack black's king side. Black's plan in these kinds of positions is always put the rook on c8 and then try to play c5 and try to disrupt white's strong center. And if they're able to do all of that, then they usually get very good counterplay. And this knight on e8 will probably come to c7, where it can support the d5 and e6 squares. So black's other option when faced with the Catalan is to take this pawn on c4. And this is definitely a sharper way to play for black. And if you're looking to establish equality right out of the opening, or even try to create some kind of problem for white, then I definitely recommend you consider this move d takes c4. Because white cannot really immediately capture this pawn or win his pawn back if they want to play for any sort of advantage. They can play a move like queen a4 check and then take this pawn, but they wasted a little bit of time in the opening moving their queen, and black is going to be able to develop very easily with a move like a6. And the point of this move is to play b5, hitting the queen with a tempo, and then developing the bishop to b7. And once black gets his bishop to b7, opposing white's bishop on g2, black is usually going to be okay because none of his pieces are going to be passive, and eventually he's going to play c5 and challenge the center and get good counterplay in the center. And out of the opening, I mean, there's not a whole lot more you could really ask for with the black pieces, other than getting all your pieces developed and having good control over the center. So this is not really what white wants to do when playing the Catalan. The more aggressive option and more ambitious option is to just continue their development and try to create some kind of pressure along the long diagonal. And now here black sort of has another choice. They can try to hold on to this pawn, or they can just leave this pawn on c4 and count on the fact that eventually white's going to have to spend time taking it, either with queen c2 and queen c4, or knight d2 and knight takes c4. And while white is spending a bit of time recapturing this pawn, then black can complete his development and play c5 and try to get counterplay. For example, a really solid option here is something like bishop e7, castles, castles, queen c2, and now a6. And again, the point of this move is that black gets to put their bishop on b7, where it challenges white's strong bishop on g2. And as you've probably already guessed, this bishop on g2 is white's best piece. So getting the bishop to b7 is a good achievement for black. And generally in these kinds of positions, it's all about whether black can comfortably play c5. So white is going to try to stop black from playing c5 with moves like rook d1, possibly a3 and b4, or knight d2 and knight b3. And black is going to try to get this move c5 in with moves like knight d7 and rook c8. Right? And if black can play c5, then his position won't really be passive, and his chances will be just as good as white's. On the other hand, if white can stop this move c5, then black is always going to have this weakness on the c-file that white could later target in some kind of endgame or late middle game position. So that's a very solid way for black to continue, and most likely they'll probably equalize if they play, relatively good moves later on. A much sharper approach than all of that is to try to hold on to this pawn through some kind of a6 and b5 plan. But of course this is very risky, because if black is wasting time playing moves like a6 and b5 this early on, they are neglecting their development. So for example, b5 is a move that they can play, and if you're playing the Catalan as white and your opponent is trying to set up these pawns on the light squares and hold on to his extra pawn at c4, there are a couple of different ways you can sort of challenge this formation. The most common way is to play the move a4. And what this does is white is just trying to break up black's pawn structure. So now if black takes this pawn, then after white recaptures and white's going to take this pawn next, black is left with these two weak pawns on the queen side, which isn't very good. And white definitely has an advantage here because they're going to be able to target these pawns later on. So typically black has to play something here like c6. And of course a move like a6 doesn't work because of this pin along the a file, and black can't recapture because his rook is hanging. So c6, and now a move like knight e5 is very common here. Opening up the bishop on the long diagonal, using the knight to pressure c6, and more often than not black is forced to block this diagonal with his knight. And then white can castle, bishop b7 is a normal move, and white can do something like e4, knight f6, knight c3. And what's going on here is that white is down a pawn, and they're probably not going to win this pawn back soon, but white's compensation is that he has very good development and very good control over the center. And a lot of times white is looking for this break through d5. Okay, when you're up in development and you have good control over the center, you want to break open the center, because then your pieces will open up, and since you're better developed, your pieces will be able to cause more damage to your opponent's position. So that's one way of sort of playing this line. Probably safer for black is to start with this move a6. And then after white castles, do something like knight c6. So black is developing, and at the same time he's getting ready to play b5 to support this pawn. And now again, white has a couple of different ways to sort of play this position. One idea is just to play knight c3 and then e4, and just try to eventually create some kind of attack either in the center or even on the king side, based on having these strong pawns on d4 and e4. Another idea that's probably a more modern way of playing this system is to play e3. And the idea behind this move is that white wants to just finish his development with queen e2, rook d1, and at some point just play this move b3, which will allow black to keep his extra pawn. For example, something like bishop d7, and a move like this is necessary because anytime black wants to play b5 in this position, they're going to have to reckon with knight e5, which is very hard to meet. Actually, black here is already losing some kind of material based on this pin along the diagonal. So bishop d7 sort of is preparing b5, queen e2, b5, and now b3. And the point is that after black takes and white takes, black is going to have an extra pawn for a long time, but white is going to be able to slowly build up pressure. So moves like bishop b2, rook fc1, and then either knight a3 or knight d2 are very natural, and white can build up pressure along the c and open a file, as well as with moves like e4 or knight e5, and so on and so forth. So to sum up, the Catalan is really a very interesting opening for both sides, because white is essentially trying to build a strong center and use this powerful bishop along the long diagonal. Another line I should mention here is that a very common move here for black is c5. And the point of this move is that they're just immediately trying to strike back at white's center. And now castles is normal, knight c6. And here white can even play a move like d takes c5, giving up control over the center, but this is still fighting for an advantage because white is going to try to prove that his bishop on g2 is better than black's bishop on c8. So something like queen d1, rook d1, bishop c5, and knight d2. And white's idea is that he wants to win this pawn back and then have this very nice bishop on g2 against this bishop on c8, which a lot of times is going to be stuck defending this b7 pawn. And, passive pieces in the endgame is really bad. But black can still probably play for equality here. It's definitely always going to be slightly better for white, but it is an endgame, and black should be able to have enough resources to hold the draw. And a good move here is to play c3, giving the pawn back, but at the same time weakening white's pawn structure. And next, black is going to castle and play bishop d7 and bring both of their rooks to the center, and white's going to play bishop b2, knight b3, and c4, and try to create some kind of pressure on the queen side. And that's pretty much the point of the Catalan, is that white wants to pressure the queen side using this strong bishop on g2 and try to use this small space advantage and c-file sometimes to cause problems and try to get slight advantage that they can press on for a while into the endgame. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.